Hi, hello everyone. Can you all hear me? Brilliant, excellent. Okay, so my name is Debbie Weeks-Bernard. I am the Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice, and I'm really delighted to be here with all of you to kickstart the discussion this afternoon around the Civic Strength Index. And actually, I'm feeling a little bit hysterical because it's actually really nice to be at an in-person event for the first time. I've been catching up with Ruth Dombey, who is the leader of Sutton Council, and she will be chairing the really important and interesting and insightful panel discussion that we're going to be hearing a little bit later on. But just catching up with her about how exciting it is to be away from the tiny screens that we've all been staring into for the past 18 months. So it's really lovely to see all of you. I just wanted to say a couple of words about why this work is so important and to thank all of those who I know have been really heavily involved in this work. I know that many of the steering group are in the room with us today, and I'd really like to thank them for all of the support and the guidance that they've given to this work. We wouldn't have been here without you, so thank you so much for all that you've done. But it's just to say, I guess, by way of kicking off the discussion, that in the role that I have as Deputy Mayor, but also as co-chair of London's Social Recovery, a chairing role that I share with Ruth Dombey, who you'll be hearing from shortly, but also from Martin Brooks, who runs London Plus. Many of you will know Martin. I have witnessed firsthand the contribution that communities have made over the past 18 months or so towards providing much needed support, guidance, help to people in their local communities who have required assistance, who have felt slightly isolated, and they have done this readily and very speedily, as many of you will have seen in the first lockdown, certainly when the pandemic began. And I think what that shows is just the nature of community strength. We're going to be talking about the Civic Strength Index, we're going to be talking about ways to understand it, but really importantly, we're going to be talking about ways to measure it. It's one of those things which many of you will know is very difficult to measure, which is why we're going to be having the conversation today. But just by way of example, just knowing the extent to which people volunteered at centres, vaccine centres when the rollout began earlier in the year, the way that mutual aid groups sprang up during the first lockdown, certainly the way that people volunteered at food banks, were delivering prescriptions, food, medicine, but also importantly, certainly in the last few months as I've had the opportunity to see, the way that people were getting in touch with those who were worried about the vaccine, sharing public health information, translating guidance, providing information and support that people had trust in, and doing so voluntarily and doing so willingly. Now, the other thing that is also incredibly important about all of that is that we also know that the extent to which that people were able to do and engage in that kind of work was not uniform. So there were parts of London, and indeed parts of the UK, where there are many mutual aid groups springing up almost overnight. But there are also parts of London, and indeed the UK, where there are not as many mutual aid groups, if any at all. And what that makes us have to do is to ask the question about what are the sorts of pre-existing conditions that need to exist to enable people to be able to engage in that type of work. What are the sorts of networks, the sorts of structures that need to be in place? And indeed, what are the sorts of pre-existing conditions which prevent those sorts of groups being able to spring up in that way? What are the gaps? And I think that's why this work is so important, because it enables us to understand what it is that enables strength to occur, as well as understanding what strength looks like. And it also helps us to understand what prevents strength from being able to occur, so that we can do all we can as decision makers, as policy makers, to ensure that all of those bits of the puzzle are in place where they need to be, so that this work can continue for those who want to engage in work of that nature. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to Zoe Wilkins from the Young Foundation. And the Young Foundation have done some incredible work trying to develop a framework so that we can begin to understand what civic strength will look like. And we will be using that framework to help us to think about what is the type of data that we might need to be able to do that measurement. what do we not have enough of? What kind of data do we not have enough of? And therefore, with that knowledge, what do we think we need to gather and to use to enable that index to become something that's real and tangible? The other thing that is massively important, and I will stop very soon, I promise, is that whilst it's really difficult to measure civic strength, there's lots of things that are actually really very difficult to measure. I have a PhD in sociology and social psychology. There's lots of things that people will say to me, you can't measure that. So I'm used to that kind of question. But what we also know is that what you measure is what is valued. And we do need to be able to value that work that communities have put in over the past 18 months. So in order to be able to value that work, we do need to be able to measure it. And that's what we're all here to discuss today. And I'm really looking forward to the contributions that we'll be having from local authorities, from those of you representing the third sector, from Londoners, from communities, about what this index could be, to what use we could put it, and how we continue to build and iterate and make it something that's really important, useful, and something that can be shared by others and is useful to those communities who will need it. So, thank you so much for bearing with me for the past 5 minutes. I'm really delighted to welcome Zoe Wilkins from the Young Foundation, who will talk about the work that they did, the findings from their research, just to kick off today. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the index and all the work that we have done so far. But yeah, look into the report for more detailed. I don't think we'll have time to read everything. But to introduce, the work was commissioned under the Building Strong Communities mission, which is one of the 9 missions in the London Recovery Board. And the Civic Strength Index serves as a key pillar to the mission. And as Debbie was just saying, it's all about thinking, how do we make everything that's happened in the last year and visible, and how can we learn from what's happened and find ways to carry it forward across London? So we engaged 700 Londoners, some in intensive workshops and then others in more light touch engagements. And through that, as well as a literature review and bringing these things together, the definition that was arrived at of civic strength is that civic strength is communities supported by robust public and social infrastructure to build strong relationships and to feel able to meaningfully engage in the issues that matter to them. So again, it's back to this idea of what needs to sit outside of kind of the measures that we might take or the numbers of things, and how can we understand how these things fit together and kind of what that wider framework is, and how can that support action going forward. And so the index is both a framework as well as the index itself, in which we've created these visualizations and these maps, which you can explore later. And this is the one that takes all of the themes that we arrived at as a way to understand civic strength together. So now I'm going to take you into each of the themes briefly. So we have relationships and social capital, democratic engagement, and public and social infrastructure, or how we thought about the 3 different dimensions of civic strength. And while there are a lot of indexes that the Young Foundation has worked on and others to try and understand community strength, what felt particular about the conversations that we had about civic strength was this democratic engagement piece and how it sits alongside relationships and social capital, as well as the public and social infrastructure, and how these 3 things coming together allow civic strength to exist and what we need to do to facilitate that. So the first theme area is relationships and social capital. In this graph, you can see all the different ways that we try to measure that. The ones that are in blue are the things that we could readily measure, we could get data for, and then in gray are things that we could either not get at quite the right level, or that we actually had trouble collecting in a way that was robust and could be measured across London. Because in many instances, there were things like one council might collect some data, or one community organization, but a challenge for us moving forward is how to think about how can we make that easier and facilitate collection so we can make civic strength more visible, and relationships and social capital in particular, because it emerged as one of the most important themes in all the conversations that we had, but also as the one that was probably the most difficult to measure, which is often the way. And here is a quick view of the map about relationships and social capital in particular. So you can kind of see there's, like, the light blue is slightly weaker areas, the dark blue is the stronger areas. And then we'll move on to democratic engagement, which emerged as our second theme of civic strength. And again, you can see we broke it down into institutional trust, accessible engagement, and civic responsibility. And then we developed key ways to try and understand that and make that visible. And again, we have our map of democratic engagement. And interestingly, it's like quite different from when you just look at relationships and social capital. Here in some areas where we had the kind of lightest colors on the outsides, here we have some of the darker ones. And so it's interesting to see who's strong where and how these things come together. Because civic strength looks quite different depending on which ward of London you look at. And then we have public and social infrastructure. And you can see by all our nice green squares that it's the easiest to measure, because a lot of this are more of the things that exist, that are measurable, but that all the same are completely necessary to have civic strength and to allow the other two to occur. And so here we have public services, financial resources, community spaces, and safety. And again, we have yet another version of kind of what's strong where. And here it's interesting, quite varied. It's not as simple as kind of the outer areas are strong in some ways, inner areas are strong in others. It's, yeah, really varied. It's, you know, in some areas you can kind of see you have a really light area next to really strong areas on this one. And so it's interesting to look at why that happens and kind of what that means for civic strength. And so we've also developed a postcode lookup, which allows you, so alongside the maps, if you type in your postcode, you would get something that looks like this. And you'll notice we're not giving you a rank. So you don't get to type in your postcode and go, oh, I'm the strongest in civic strength, or I'm the weakest, or anything like that. Instead, what in many conversations with the steering group we decided to focus on was an idea of a mix of civic strengths. So to look at a ward in London and say, okay, maybe they're actually really strong on trust and social cohesion, opportunities for community life, and access to public services. And that would be quite interesting. And then you say, okay, well, what allows that ward to have that unique mix? And why does the ward next door have quite a different mix? And what does that reveal to us about kind of what's happened over the last year, but also what kind of action we want to take to move forward? And so it's really, the goal of this index is to provide a framework for thinking about civic strength, but also to think about like how each area of London is unique and what we can do to support that and kind of grow from there. And if you read the report, which hopefully all of you will, you'll notice that we have a kind of a short conclusion section, but most of our conclusion is actually centered around calls to action. And that we came up with the steering group and with Farah and Hannah as an idea of, well, this is like a first iteration of something that we really want to continue and to be made stronger. Some of that is through data collection. Other parts of that are through people going out and looking at the index, trying to understand what feels true about the area, what feels different, and understanding how we can make even more communities visible. For example, communities of identity came up in the workshops, but at this stage, we couldn't collect enough data to measure on a map. But we're trying to think moving forward about how to do that better, and we hope all of you will help us do that. Sorry. I will play his video. I didn't realize it was going to start right away. And so now we're going to show you an example of community strength that came from the Festival of Ideas that the GLA ran in June. And so now, there we go.
We just arrived Shelby Centre. I could not even believe this is around the corner from Village 101. I have never seen so much beauty in one space. Really, down to the architecture of the space, down to the people that are here filling it. This is what it means to really repopulate London again, really take our way of living back again. That's what I'm so proud to see. I'm so happy to be a part of it. I come down today for my wallet. We're going to do some ukumbuz, drum healing today. And we're going to bring the ancestors through and let them come into the land and see what they want to share with us this evening. It's your boy Motivation, Activation for the Nation. Let's go.
The reason why we're here, I want everyone to know we're here because we've been on the, I'd say, the battlefield. We've been volunteering for more than a year. Personally, I came out on the 13th of March last year. The pandemic was not even actually announced on the news, and some of us have been out here since then, and some have joined in. And whatever stage you joined in, you're committed to this community. You've committed to this community. It's not a paid job, it's just that you thought to yourself, look, let me come out and help. And I like to tell you that this was a funded event. So I applied for the Mayor of London Festival of Ideas, and you had to come up with an idea to bring the community together. And I thought, what better idea than the volunteers? Because not often do we get a thank you. So pick up yourselves, pick up yourselves, pick up yourselves. And I personally, as well as the other organisers, which is on the certificate, would like to say a big thank you. You don't have to do it, you've done it. People have really been suffering out there and we have helped them. Yeah, and in helping them, we've helped ourselves. And that's what community is about. It's about love. It's about bringing everyone together and just committing yourself. There is nothing going on in this community unless there's love in this community. Do you understand? So big up to love, big up to community. Look around you, everyone's smiling. This is what Tottenham is about, this is what Haringey is about, and let's just keep it up. Yeah, let's keep it up. Keep the momentum, keep the caps, and look up to the sky every now and again. We're doing it. Big up.
Helping others, we've helped ourselves. I think she just summed it up. We could stop now, couldn't we? It's really great to be here. It's really lovely to see so many people here. And it's really good to see some of the people with whom I've been working for the last 15 months in person. Martin, hello. I've been watching you and talking to you and working with you on the screen for such a long time. It's lovely to see you in person. So I am very excited, insanely excited, because as Debbie said, it is great to be in the room together. I got on the underground for the first time yesterday in 15 months. I'm excited because we're here, actually. I hadn't realised until I looked more carefully on the map. This is where my family's from. When my family immigrated to this country in the early 1900s because of persecution, they came to live in this part of London. So as soon as I realised we were talking about Whitechapel and this area, I realised that this is where my roots are, so even more exciting. But I think the real reason I'm properly excited about this is because I believe this is going to make a huge difference. Being able to measure something may seem a bit esoteric for those of us who are data nerds, and I'm going to guess everyone in the audience is, otherwise why would we be here? Data is important, but data is important because it allows us not only to make a difference, but to work out where we can prioritize our ever-increasingly scarce resources. It would be lovely if we could provide universal services for absolutely everyone, widen the net, and hope that we catch everyone. But we know that isn't possible. And so when we talk about targeted services, when we talk about identifying where what we're doing will have the greatest impact and make a difference to people's lives, it's really important that we can measure it. And I was reminded as I read the report, showing off, I've read it, I was reminded of a conversation I had shortly before the election back in May. Knocked on the door of a lady in my ward. It's always an interesting moment as they start to open the door, because you never know, even if you've got the name on the list, you never quite know who you're going to be talking to. So a lovely lady opened the door. I explained who I was. I was her local ward councillor. We started to talk. She explained that she was a single mum with 2 school-aged children and had only recently moved to the borough. And so, of course, I said, what do you think of Sutton? And again, there's that split second where you know it could go anyway. It could, Sutton's wonderful, I love it, love living here. Or it could go, I've got this complaint about this particular bit of fly tipping. Or it could be quite apathetic, don't really know what the council does, don't really understand why you're here, who are you anyway? What I actually got, and this is a true story, what I actually got was, Sutton is amazing, it's a paradise. So I grinned, as you would, I'm leader of the council, I grinned, and then I said, that's great, but could you explain what it is that makes it so special? And she started to talk to me about the fact that as a woman of Bangladeshi heritage, moving to a completely new area with 2 school-aged children, she had been made to feel welcome. And that although she'd only been living there for a couple of months, she felt she was part of the community, and that her children had made friends, and that she had got to know the parents of the children that her children had made friends with, that she was aware that there were things to do in the area, and she was seriously thinking about picking up some of the hobbies that she hadn't done for a long time because she'd been busy bringing up her children. And then she started to say, do you think that might help me get back into work? And this whole conversation was about someone saying to me, because of the area where I live, and she'd moved there by chance, I can't believe she'd sat down and done a desktop exercise or didn't have the benefit of your wonderful map, but she had found herself in a place where there was community support, community infrastructure, where there was community, a sense of community, a sense of identity, and where people were looking out for each other. And I think this is what we're trying to measure. Up until now, it's been really difficult. You can feel it sometimes. You can feel you're in an area where people care about each other, but you can't really explain why. And more importantly, you can't bottle it up and take it somewhere else. Because we need to learn from each other, and we need to learn from our own experiences. Showing the map, Zoe, I immediately looked at my own borough because, of course, it's inevitable, isn't it? Really good to see dark blue all over the place, really good. So I was really pleased to see that we're doing well, but I know that there will be all sorts of good examples of practical things that we can do, not just to help generally, but to improve the sort of services and the way that we communicate in different parts of our borough. COVID has taught me that particularly in a borough like mine in Outer London, the deeply rooted inequalities that we have in our society is a lot about place. I know it's not only about place, I know there are other factors and there's intersectionality, but if I look at the people who are most hesitant about coming forward to get the COVID vaccine, they are geographically based. And if I look about where the deprivation is, it is geographical. And I think the opportunity to have something like this where we can share examples, where we can look at good practice, where we can think about what has had an impact, what can make a difference, is going to be really important. So I'm absolutely delighted that we're doing this, and I'm going to stop talking now because you haven't come to hear from me, you've come to hear from the panel. And we've got a fantastic panel of 4 people who are going to be talking about this work, each of them from a very different perspective. So can I introduce, first of all, Richard Harries, who is Associate Director for the Institute of Community Studies at the Young Foundation. Do you want to come up, Richard? Richard made a very, very sensible decision a few years ago to move to Sutton, he told me. He's a very clever man, and he's the one that's going to take all the technically difficult questions, I'm told, as he's been working on the index, its development and methodology. Tunde Aleninko is Director for Communities, Royal Borough. I have to always say Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Tunde, you've been invited to share your perspective from a local authority point of view, particularly as your Director of Communities. Not to come up. Thank you.
Sorry.
Christine Goodall is the Network Coordinator for HERE, which is a fantastic group, the Human Rights and Equalities Network. And I know, Christine, from the work that we're doing on the London Recovery Board, just how strong and passionate your voice has been, talking about this sort of work from a voluntary sector perspective, but particularly looking at it through equalities and equity. And then David Harris, who is the Director of the West London Alliance. David, do you want to come up? So David previously worked at MHCLG. Those were in the days where we had a ministry that included local government. Eh? And now he works at the West London Alliance because he knows that local government is where it's all at. West London Alliance, just for those of you who don't know, is the whole of London is divided into sub-regions because it means we can work together across a wider area than just in one individual borough. And David is here representing 7 West London boroughs, so he can talk about it from a wider perspective, local government. So I'm now going to move over and ask each of the panellists if you would like to introduce yourselves and just talk very briefly about how you think this report, this work, is going to have an impact on the organisation where you are. Tunde, do you want to begin?
Oh, thank you for that honour.
Local government.
So I'm Tunde Aleninko. I'm the Director for Communities in Kensington and Chelsea. I don't usually use the Royal Borough for obvious reasons. I'll say a little bit about my career. I actually started in Kensington and Chelsea many years ago, back in the 90s, and I worked in their youth and community department when it was still owned by the council. I did a variety of jobs connections. I worked in youth services. I was a teenage pregnancy coordinator, teenage pregnancy prevention, I should add, before moving to central government, where I did a variety of roles there as well, mostly around EDI. I worked on the Lammy Review for Race and Criminal Justice System, but I also worked on the government's Grenfell response. And then my last role in central government was working as the Deputy Director for Communities and Integration before coming back to Kensington and Chelsea as their Director for Communities. So that's me. What does a Civic Strength Index mean to me? I think this is a first step, and a really strong first step to codifying the building blocks for what makes a strong community. As Debbie said earlier, these things are notoriously hard to measure, but this is the first iteration and a really, really strong starting point, I have to say, in helping us as across London, particularly from a local authority point of view, from having some commonality in what we measure and how we track progress. I think for me, it really will help us to learn from each other. And like Ruth said, the first thing I did was look to see what the map said about Kensington and Chelsea, and I was pleasantly surprised. But it also gave food for thought in relation to where we are and what we can do. And I also looked at where others were. And I'm really pleased to say that across London councils, we're starting for the first time a network of directors for communities, or my equivalents in each local authority, and this will be a really good place to start discussions about how we can work together to become greater than the sum of our parts. Thank you.
That's great, Tunde, thank you. And I think it's really important, certainly when I'll be talking to other councillors about this work, this isn't a league table. This isn't about working out who's the best and who's the worst. This is very much about saying, what has worked in a particular area? Why did it work there? Is it something that I can then bring into a different part? And I think that's within our boroughs as well as across our boroughs. But I just wanted to make that point, because otherwise too easily it will start to becoming, oh, they're doing a good job and they aren't. And that's actually not what this is all about. Christine, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Christine Goodall. I'm the network coordinator for HERE, which is the Equality and Human Rights Network for London. I know many of you, and probably most of you know about HERE, but for those that don't, we are a network for any organisation, community group, and increasingly individual people who are campaigning or activists for equality and human rights in their communities, across all different equality specialisms and across topics that are very relevant to people in those groups, for example, homelessness, people who are ex-offenders, violence against women and girls, all those kind of overarching topics, as well as the different equality specialism. We've got over 1,000 members in our network, so really HERE is only really about the strength of its members, and our role is facilitating those members to come together and work together, and particularly across different equality specialisms, to learn from each other, and so that large, medium-sized, tiny organisations and individuals can come together. So our members range from like large national charities who happen to be based in London that work in equalities issues, right through to very small grassroots user-led groups, and as I said, individuals. And our particular focus is on pan-equality working, intersectional working, and championing user-led and grassroots groups, and the input of experts by experience, and that's really our role. And I have been able to read the report, and from his point of view, briefly, because I know I can say more later, I think that it would be very useful as a framework for us to look at when we're looking at the work we do with our members. So that kind of framework of themes and domains, I think it's very important sometimes when you're trying to facilitate policy and campaigning work and civic engagement and democratic engagement, that you've got some kind of like framework, because it can be such a large, overwhelming area of work. I think it's good to have evidence from research that you can point to when you're talking about things. That's always good. I think for us, the themes and the domains will probably be initially more useful to us than the granular geographic information. It was mentioned about communities of interest, and for us, obviously, that's a very important area. And we're hoping that we'll be able to work with some of you about thinking about how we can bring that more into this. Although saying that, the geographic information will be really helpful for us to identify where the voluntary and community sector is stronger or weaker, so for us as infrastructure organisations, we might want to focus and work. And finally, I was really, really pleased to see the emphasis on relationships and particularly trust. So trust comes into two of the themes, really. So the relationships and social capital is more about the trust between people and communities, and that's an area that I've got particular background in researching, and also, of course, the institutional trust in democratic engagement. So for me, and for here, we've done a lot of work on trust. Our Festival of Ideas event was entirely based on looking at the issue of trust. So I was really pleased to see that there, and I feel that that's really important.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you and everyone in here for all the work that you're doing. I know I talked a lot about identity of place, but this is just the beginning of the conversation, and I know when we come to you later, Richard, you'll be able to talk to us about the fact that this is an iterative process, and that, Christine, we will need people like your organisations to help overlay that intersectionality, that deeper understanding of inequalities and how people are disadvantaged before they even start the day, and how we can overlay that on the work that we're doing around place, because people are complex and life is complex, and that's fine. That's why we're all here. So, David, do you want to talk about the job you have bringing together 7 London boroughs? That must be fun.
Yes, so I'm the director of the West London Alliance, which is a partnership of 7 West London boroughs, which I lead, reporting into 7 chief executives and 7 leaders. And I've been given the easy task of trying to say something about how the Civic Strength Index, how we can use that to ensure that we're influential in terms of policy development around the levelling up agenda. Now, if anyone in the room can tell me what the levelling up agenda is going to mean in practice, I'll stop talking now and you can carry on for me. But hopefully I can give some kind of pointers in terms of the direction that I think it may be going in, and what that might mean for London boroughs. So, like Andy Haldane, the ex-Bank of England head economist, and now the new head of the government's task force on levelling up, I grew up in Leeds, and I've lived in London for many years as well before moving out, but I think that tells a story about London as well, because many people move into London and move out of London, and there's people who have grown up after generation in London, and then you get blow-ins like me as well. So there's a story there to be told. But I grew up in Leeds, and after reading the Civic Strength Index report, I really feel the need to kind of hold myself back from being too gushing, because I don't think that would fit with the Yorkshire stereotype. But in short, I think it is an excellent piece of work, and it's got lots of useful pointers for how we can make it even better. And having worked in a range of so why do I think it's brilliant? But having worked in a range of central government departments, and in my current role leading seven boroughs as the West London Alliance Partnership, finding a framework that brings together data with a focus on place, it's been a bit like a search for the Holy Grail, really. So it's a grand claim, but I think it's a really, really good bit of work that perhaps could even be the Holy Grail that we've all been looking for. It pulls together lots of existing data at ward level, and it uses the 3 domains which have already been set out. And I think it's really timely. So in addition to Haldane being drafted in to lead the Levelling Up Task Force, MHCLG, which is one of my old departments, it's lost its local authority in its title. And Michael Gove is now the new Secretary of State. I think the debate is raging about what the fact that local authorities is no longer part of the department's title, what does that mean? I think there's a bit of a debate that's going on around that. But as I've already said, I think the government's got some work to do in terms of defining what levelling up actually is. So I think this index could be helpful in helping government to define what levelling up is. And actually, I think Andy Haldane being appointed in his role is a good thing. I think he's talked a lot of sense in the past. I'm not just saying that because he's from Leeds. In a recent speech that he gave at the local trust, a speech on community empowerment, he framed his argument around 3 things. One of them was the need for a fundamental rethink and refresh of our model of capitalism. So that's easy. The other one was around specific steps that might be taken now to strengthen community institutions and infrastructure, which I think is more pragmatic, and I think talks to a lot of the things that's in the Civic Index, Civic Strength Index. And the third one was around monies, powers, and people. And he described those 3 things as the holy trinity of community capitalism. So I think it's good news that he's been brought in to lead this work, and we'll see what comes of it. So we've got the holy trinity of community capitalism, and arguably, as I've said, the Civic Strength Index is the holy grail to make community empowerment a reality. I'm drawing a lot on Haldane's speech here, so you've probably noticed that. But I think it is really relevant. Because the other point of note that he made was that in the past, government funding has tended to be sort of competitive bids with central pots of money, short-term money, and it's tended to kind of lock in the advantages that certain areas already have, because if you can bid for the money successfully, then you're probably doing all right anyway in many respects. And he also talked about the 200 million that was which the government announced as part of this year's budget for the Levelling Up Fund. And we all know how badly London did from that funding. But he also makes the point that a lot of the funding was focused on capital projects rather than social capital and building sort of civic strength. So again, I think that really talks well to what we're trying to do here. So in summary then, I think the Civic Strength Index is a fantastic bit of work. It's timely, and it can be a very useful evidence base for London to use as part of helping the government define levelling up. And I think what Haldane said chimes with the Building Strong Communities mission, which is part of the London recovery work. I think it adds to our evidence base of why levelling up needs to happen in London as well as across the country. I think that's really important. And I think it's also going to be really useful in terms of what we're trying to do as London boroughs to build back better from the pandemic. So in West London, I think it's going to be really useful for the work that we're doing with the cross-sector task force on economic recovery. And I think, Ruth, you touched on it in terms of some of the sort of the health and inequalities that have been made worse during the pandemic. There's a lot of work going on across London around health inequalities, so I think it can be really useful for our work that we're doing with NHS colleagues as well, and with other anchor institutions across London. So I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with you all here and hearing what everyone else has got to say, and actually, you know, working with the rest of the people on the panel and with the GLA and with you, Ruth, to kind of take this work forward to make sure we turn it into something that's really beneficial and doesn't just sit on the shelf.
Thanks, David. I mean, I have to admit, I struggle with the term levelling up. I'm not clear what we're levelling up to, and I've yet to hear anyone explain that. And I just think it's far more complex than that, which is why I'm going to come to you next, Richard, because what we're trying to measure is, you could argue, immeasurable. So how do you measure the complexity of people's lives, the deep-rooted inequalities that exist, that are structural and exist within our society, and have been really slammed in our face because of COVID? How do you measure that in a way that's meaningful? And could you say a few words about how you see the work progressing? Because I see this very much as the beginning of the journey rather than a finished report.
Yes, absolutely. I'm delighted to do that, Ruth. And just by way of background, you know, I got the communities bug when I was working with David Blunkett when he was Home Secretary back in 2000, 2001. And he was talking about what he called, in those days, civil renewal. The idea that civil society and the state don't have to be in opposition with each other, that actually the two can work very well together, and that it's the right way to do things. You know, for the last 5 years, I was working at Path Change, which supports community-run businesses across England. And you could see this firsthand. In fact, I've been to the Selby Centre and know it well. And you know, the energy and agency you get when local people are involved in doing things that matter to them is enormous and quite wonderful. And then, as you said, Ruth, I'm now at the Young Foundation. I'm the Associate Director for the Institute of Community Studies. For those who know the history of the Young Foundation, it used to be the Institute of Community Studies where Michael Young set it up. It became the Young Foundation, and then a couple of years ago, Helen Goulden, the current Chief Executive, sitting in the back of the room, made the excellent decision to recreate the Institute of Community Studies within the Young Foundation, precisely because there is not a proper focus in this country on what's working in communities and what we know about communities and what matters to communities. Research agendas aren't set with communities in mind, and the research doesn't involve them, and there's just we're missing a huge problem. I saw this firsthand when I was in government. You know, charities and social enterprises would come in and they'd tell me about the good work they're doing, and it's always good work. That's never really the question. But then they would hand over what they considered to be evidence. And Tunde and David will know this. You just have to stop the smile from creeping across your face, thinking, I can't show that to my finance team. I can't show that to the Treasury. It's not of a sufficient quality and depth, because it turns out that when you're working at that really hyper-local neighbourhood ward level, demonstrating the difference you're making is really difficult. It's a tough research question, and there's nobody there to support you to do it, and so it's just really hard. And so, coming full round to the question you asked me, what I found so enjoyable about working on this piece of work, and really all the credit has to go to Zoe and her colleague Jana, who've just done fantastic work on it, is that it brought a maturity to the whole process, which you rarely see. It's so easy, as you were suggesting, when it comes to numbers, to get obsessed with the numbers and what do the weights mean and where am I at the top or the bottom of the list. And the entire process that we've gone through, engaging with the steering group, engaging with stakeholders, engaging with Londoners, has been all about what matters to you. What are the priorities that you think are important, and how can we best try to capture them? And so it's been an incredible, incredibly empowering process, I've got to say, because at no stage has there been a sort of we're better and you're worse or whatever. It's been how can we understand what this tells us about civic strength in London and where can we go with it. Which is not to say that it couldn't be, again, Ruthie, I think you indicated it could be used in a malicious way if people wanted to. But all the sense I've got is that everybody sees the potential for using this as a diagnostic tool, as a way of understanding and trying to improve. And it does need improvement, there's no doubt about that. You'll have seen that from those rather wonderful maps. There are some areas where they all appear to be the same colour because we only have data at borough level, not at ward level. Or there are some indicators that we couldn't measure that we would really like to measure, that the community told us were important to them, but the data's not available. So it's the start of a journey, but it's the right journey to be taking, actually, and we've got the right people to help guide us on that journey.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Richard. Really, really good. I'm going to ask the panel a couple of questions, but then I'm keen to open it up to the floor. And I know that there are people following the live stream, and they'll be able to put their questions in, and people in the audience will be able to feed me those questions. But I just wanted to start, Tunde, with you, because I see the role of local governments really important in this. Apart from anything else, we have a huge amount of data. We know who has an assisted collection. We know who has free school meals. I can think of all sorts of different ways that we collect information so we can ensure that our resources get to the right people in the right place. How do you see this work going forward so that as local authorities we can contribute and help build that understanding with the insight that we have with our communities?
I think it's right what you've said. Local authorities do collect a lot of data. But if I'm honest, I've seen a lot of data that's collected that probably isn't, it hasn't been renewed or refreshed for a long time. So a lot of the data sets collected might not speak to the problems that you're actually facing. Thinking about Kensington and Chelsea, for example, I think there are massive opportunities for us to invest in data collection. To ensure that not only us as a local authority, but our strategic partners are collecting data. So, for example, I think you just spoke a lot about some of our third sector colleagues perhaps not having the capacity to collect data. That will be very important for us at local authority level to improve and strengthen communities. So I think there's lots of opportunities here for us to have a really mature conversation with all partners to say, actually, what is the data we need in this place in order to strengthen communities? What this index has given us is the ability to actually have, particularly with the three themes, to have the starting point of saying these are common objectives for all of us. The parts, looking at this and speaking very personally of Kensington and Chelsea, I saw the parts where we were quite strong was about grants, the public infrastructure themes. But there were other areas in terms of relationship and social capital, which I don't think we in Kensington and Chelsea have a focus on, and I'm sure that will be repeated with other local authorities. And just to thinking very of recent events, particularly in the theme of relationship and social capital, we saw amazing civic spirit after when lockdown occurred. The volunteering, it cut across boundaries. I can't confirm what levelling up means, but everyone was locked down, so everyone was in a way levelled down. And that, I think, created the conditions where people across class barriers in Kensington and Chelsea in particular came out and worked together in a way that hasn't been, we haven't seen before. I think for us is the challenge will be to how do we keep that up, but more importantly, how do we measure that it's being kept up? So in answer to your question, I think that the GLA could play a role. I've seen, for example, we've taken part in the Advice in Community Settings programme that the GLA have been running, where they've incentivised local authorities and the VCS to work together in order to create capacity rather than have a quick focus on outcomes. And I think in the past, a lot of grants have been about how are you going to deliver this outcome, rather than how are you going to create the capacity to deliver this outcome and sustain it. And I really think that the GLA can play a real part in incentivising, sometimes with money, but with convening power that can bring local authorities and various partners together around this framework.
I agree. Thank you, Tunde. And I think we'd all agree we've all been impacted by the COVID pandemic in some way or another. It's just that some of us are coping better than others, and that's because of our personal circumstances, our abilities and disabilities, who we are, our life experience and our skills. And Christine, can I bring you in? Because we're focusing on place, which is understandable, and we all love a good map. But my worry is that by the focus on place and doing the data at a ward level, we'll start to lose some of those individualities, some of those particular obstacles that people are finding that are particular to them and the lives that they're leading. Do you want to come in on that?
Yes, thank you. Yes, so yes, as I mentioned before, the whole communities of identity or interest, however you like to phrase it, are also really important in this for a couple of reasons. One is obviously that people with shared characteristics or identities are experiencing particular issues, problems, and have also particular strengths that go right across geographical boundaries, and also the places and spaces, whether they're real or virtual, that they come together to work on things together, often do transcend those boundaries, and are not specifically very local, partly because it would be not very practical to be able to have people coming together about all those different issues in every single locality. It's just not feasible and possible. And also people, as well as that, people from different backgrounds and identities and life experiences don't necessarily always wish to engage in coming together in their local community. There may be barriers that where they prefer not to do that, or just by the very nature of their lives. You know, there are many examples of that. People who are involved in domestic and sexual violence, people who are asylum seekers, homeless people, and so on. They all contribute to what we're talking about in this report, but they're not necessarily going to be wishing to or able to come together in very specific local geographical spaces. What they think of their neighbourhood is not necessarily the same as other people might do, or they may not necessarily feel safe in a particular neighbourhood and able to come together. So I think that's a really important factor. And for us, for the HERE members, I think a lot of where this resonates is around being able to have meaningful democratic participation from the point of view of being able to have influence over decisions that affect people's lives. And this will be an important way to highlight that. But I think as well as the strengths, we can also use this as an opportunity to think about the barriers that people have to that. So whether they're very practical barriers like digital exclusion and so on, those kind of things that we want to promote people having shared goals. That's one of the things that has been coming out very much for us. We can kind of sometimes assume that people have a shared vision of what they would like to see or shared goals, but sometimes we make assumptions, and it's about exploring that. I think that's really important. And respect for people's intersectional identities is another thing that's been coming out really very much from what our members have been saying to us. People want to participate, they want to contribute, they want to get involved in things, but often people with complex intersectional identities that involve their sexual orientation or their ethnic background, or a disability and so on, or lifestyles as well, So, for example, people in life circumstances where they're like single parents and so on, and the whole complexity of people's identity means that they often find that they're not respected and welcomed in particular communities, and that can be like a barrier before they start. We've acknowledged that lots of people have come across, have come together during COVID across all those different divides, but there are still lots of people we're hearing that don't feel that their own selves, as they are as individual people, are being respected, and so that's a barrier for them to get involved.
I think that's really powerful, Christine, and democratic engagement and voice is absolutely key to this. I think that often we think that we've looked at the possible obstacles, that we think we've sorted it out, but it isn't until actually you involve people and understand what it's like for them as individuals. I'm thinking of a lady who recently became a councillor in my area who uses a motorised scooter because she had polio when she was little. We thought we had an accessible building, turns out we don't. And it's only because of the fact that she's navigating that building that she's taught us that actually we need to make an awful lot of improvements. So involving people and ensuring that their voices are heard loud and clear, I think is really, really important. David, can I come to you? Because you're here, I won't say you're representing 7 boroughs, that wouldn't be fair, but the geographical area that you cover covers a huge amount going from extreme wealth to extreme poverty. So in your role, looking at that area and thinking about what Christine has just said about individuals and their personal circumstances, how do you see us being able to use the index in the report, in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so, I mean, the index is been broken down to a ward level. Now, the 7 West London Alliance boroughs covers a population of about 2 million people. So it is huge, and in terms of the economy, I always quote this, but it's bigger than Glasgow, Leeds and Birmingham combined.
Bigger than Leeds, you heard that here.
Yeah. So it is a huge scale, but I think what you can do at that scale is you can compare and contrast. So you can do that at a borough level, and you can do it at a sub-regional level, and you can start to ask questions about, why is it that a particular ward has got these strengths, and what outcomes is that leading to? And then those areas can learn from each other, and I think it's already been mentioned, but it will allow us to sort of target the boroughs, to target their resources to the areas, and to put in the kind of interventions that are going to make the biggest difference. I think what you said, Tunde, about capacity as well, being able to win an argument which says, if we invest in this capacity, it will lead to this outcome, that should be enough, really, rather than having to sort of prove that you've delivered the outcome, which everyone knows you can write that up in whichever way you want anyway. I think, just changing the mindset a little bit, and saying, right, okay, if we're going to use the levelling up lexicon, then, levelling up should be about building capacity in all of the areas, in all of the wards, and making sure that no wards are being left behind. And there are some obvious ones like, access to green spaces, which I think has already been mentioned. There's some things which are easier to measure, but I think it's really interesting around, the social capital. What does that really mean? And I think, your point again, Tunde, about the lockdown levelling people down, and then not allowing people to work, to speak to people who they may have never, they may have walked past every day, but all of a sudden we're having conversations and we're all in the same boat. So, how do we kind of keep some of that secret ingredient without having to lock down again?
That's a challenge.
Absolutely, absolutely right. I'm going to open it up to the audience. I'm happy to take questions. Rather than someone rushing around with a roving mic, which would be this mic, and then having to give it back to me again, I'm going to suggest that if you'd like to ask your question, I'll then repeat it for the live stream and then ask the panel to answer. So who's going to put their hand up first? There's always one who's braver than everyone else. Otherwise, I'll pick on someone. Thank you.
Sorry, my name's John Griffiths. I work for a couple of rocket science, and we've been on the advisory panel for this work. I think it's a brilliant piece of work, like I said, well done. Those who were part of it, they're beating, were surprised at the question of the four of which are very, very clearly represented in the work here. Individuals, active individuals, an active voluntary society, civil society and charity sector, a resource public statutory sector with institutions, and vibrant places. The fifth foundation is business. And I'd like to understand or get your views on what this means to business and why is a strong civic society important to business, and what business indicators would we want to include to show that that is part of a vibrant civic society in terms of this business.
It's a really good question, thank you. For the benefit of the live stream, so the report and the work is looking at various domains, looking at various sectors of society, but there's a suggestion that we should be looking more at the business side of things and the role that business can play and how business groups would benefit from this work. David, come to you first.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, I don't want to hark back to definitions, but we need to be clear about what we mean by business, because it covers quite a wide group, doesn't it? And I think there's the obvious kind of employment angle in terms of, people need work, don't they? But you asked about what does it mean to business, and I think, a lot of businesses are now getting used to a new way of working. So, people working at home, for example, and for outer London boroughs, that's changing the way neighbourhoods are made up. So, actually, some of the outer London boroughs have benefited from people using the high street again, and going out for a coffee to meet up with friends while they're working from home. So there's a benefit to business there in that kind of, how do people work and balance their life, and there's a community dimension that you can build around that. But then, some of the bigger corporates, they're sort of saying, well, we still need people to come into the office, and one of the things that they feel that they need is a sense of place and identity. And again, the civic and community aspect of that, what is a vibrant community? Well, it's nothing if there's not people there. So, I think there's an angle there for business. I know that a lot of the corporate leaders in West London, they're really interested in this concept of, sense of place and identity. And then I think there's every business will talk about sort of corporate social responsibility, and I think some of the things that have happened during the pandemic, everyone talks about Amazon's really benefited, but that's the consequence of that is every 5 minutes there's a van going up and down your street, isn't there? And so I think there's something about what does that mean for the way we enjoy our neighbourhoods, and I think there are another this is all kind of just off the top of my head here, sort of it might be coming across, but I think there's something about the kind of the digital side as well, and sort of digital inclusion, because there's a lot of, to use the technical term, channel shift. People are got used to ordering things online. So again, what does that mean for business? What does that mean for communities? So I think it's a really important point which we shouldn't ignore. Is how does business fit into this? But we need to think about the sort of different types of business as well as part of answering that question.
Absolutely, and I think in this new world where we've learnt that you can work virtually, preferably not the whole time, I think people are going to be making different decisions about where they work, how they work. If they really want to get up at 6:30 in the morning and stand on an overcrowded commuter train every single morning, and I think that's going to change people's expectations of the place where they live and the opportunities that they have in that place. Purely anecdotally, there's a lot of people from Hong Kong moving to my borough. They've worked out it's the best place in London, they're right. But what they're telling us is over 50% of them are going to be starting up their own businesses, and we're saying to them, why don't you think about starting up your business here locally rather than paying expensive real estate in the centre of London? So I think there is going to be this change, and we have to be flexible and adaptable, but make sure that everyone has opportunities to benefit from that. Richard, do you want to come in?
Yes, please, thank you. And by the way, I know what you mean exactly about commuting. Power to Change was based in Elephant and Castle, which meant I had to get the Thameslink train from Hackbridge, where forget 2 metres of social distancing, you're lucky if you get 2 millimetres of social distancing. But now I'm on the overground coming up to Whitechapel, and it's delightful. It's just great. So thank you for the GLA for giving us the overground a few years ago. The point about business, I think, is really important, because the points David made are quite right. I mean, obviously for large corporates, there's the whole ESG agenda, and that does absolutely have an impact. But most businesses are small businesses, and London's got quite a lot of them. And, you know, when I think about key sort of areas in my neighbourhood, the corner shop, the chippy, these are important places where you go and you know them, and they are trusted spaces. And so I think it would be great to see the next iteration of the index try to look at that. My suggestion is that it's not just looking at, obviously, the number of visitors. That would be absurd because that wouldn't really tell you much. But more about the relationships. If there's a way of capturing the relationship and the degree of localness of the business, I think that would be a fascinating insight.
Absolutely, thanks, Richard. I'm going to take another question and point out that there are far more ladies than men in the audience. Thank you. Your question. That's a really interesting question. I'm going to struggle to repeat it. So it's about our proper understanding of London as a city, and that it's not either or. It's how this is about all of us and what we're doing here. This is I'm not doing you justice. I'm sorry, it was such a great question. But it's about all of us. It's not about us or them. And I think that's a really important point. Christine, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. Georgie, that is a great question, and that was something that actually was pointed out in one of the meetings that I attended recently. Apologies for the person who raised it, I can't remember exactly. It may have been even one of the colleagues in this room. But it was really about this whole thing of London being sort of viewed from outside, I suppose, in a particular way that you know, levelling up isn't almost relevant to London, and it's only places outside London and the immediate southeast that it's referring to. And I think it is really, really important to remember that there are huge disparities and inequalities in London, and I think this report will help, you know, provide some evidence along with other sources of the difference in different parts of London. I mean, anyone that actually lives here is, you know, you'd have to be like completely your head in the sand not to understand that it's so diverse, not just in its population, but in the disparities in health and housing, and there are boroughs in London, many of them, where great sort of poverty and deprivation exist, alongside you know, huge wealth and so on, and so I think it's different parts of London. And it's even down to a more local, granular level, and perhaps looking even at the small ward level. Are we providing accessible opportunities for everyone that lives in that locality? I think it's about actual outcomes, and it's also about you know, the opportunities and them being accessible.
I agree, Christine. And I was thinking about Kensington and Chelsea, Dundee, and, you know, the huge wealth in some parts of the borough with those £1 million cars being revved up and down outside Harrods, and yet just 15, 20 minutes away, dire poverty. Do you want to come in on that?
Yes, and that's exactly what I was thinking as I was listening to the last answer. In Kensington and Chelsea, you're either very rich if you live there, or you're living in social housing. There is no middle ground. Even if you're renting privately there, it'll be beyond many of our pay packets, probably all of our pay packets. I think in answering the question, when I left central government, I think Boris Johnson had just got in, and it was very obvious the first iteration of Levelling Up, and it may still be the same iteration without listening to his speech, was really about regional. And as I worked on the integration programme, there was I think we had one area in Waltham Forest, and it was about how do you create cohesion, but we had Blackburn and Darwin, we had all of these different areas. And I have to admit, as a Londoner born and bred, it was quite shocking to see the difference in economic outputs, the economy in different parts of the country. And I think we did a bit of an analysis, and when you took London and the South East away from the national economy, I think that the rest of England was about the same level as Romania. So it was all about infrastructure, and it was quite funny having colleagues from the Department of Transport say, we've been told to sort out this bus route and make sure there's more buses, where they were used to building sort of high-speed railways and so on and so forth. So it didn't bode well for London councils, because it was really seen through that lens. I'm hoping now that more thought has gone into it, that it will be looking at levelling up in terms of giving everybody the opportunity to succeed. Having not seen it, I can't say that, heard the speech, I can't say that it will. I do know that in DFE they are looking at levelling up in terms of those children who through, because of lockdown, because of the disadvantages that they've been born into for an accident of birth, have done poorly in exams, and that's not necessarily, they're not necessarily looking at it geographically. However, I think our unique problem in London, and exasperated in Kensington and Chelsea, is that it's not geographic. We do have areas of deprivation in Kensington and Chelsea like we do in London, but they're side by side with people who are very, very wealthy. And winning that argument, I think will be our challenge. And I think in answer to your question, the best way, the only way we can do it is to unite. And this is why the Civic Strength Index is a great tool to unite us, so that we speak with one voice. Yeah. So it isn't necessarily the Labour Mayor of London lobbying for London, because I remember going to one of your events just at the cusp of lockdown. We heard from someone from up north who said, we cheered when Brexit happened, when the Brexit vote came in, because it wasn't so much about Brexit, it was like, ha, London. Now you've got to listen to us in the north. And I think for those of us who are based in London and working in London, we sometimes can be oblivious to how we are seen as being really privileged in relation to other parts of England. So I think we've got a challenge now to be empathetic and understand that there are areas, because I can't deny it, there are areas, regional differences, but also make the same point that within our region there are vastly different outcomes and situations, and that will be a challenge of us uniting and saying that with the right argument, so it doesn't become a them and us. It becomes actually where we've all got problems, and actually trying to define the levelling up agenda rather than have it told to us through a particular political lens. And I hope that's not going upstream. Thank you.
But it's also how we learn from each other, isn't it? I'm really interested to look at some of the examples in the report, and then as we go forward, learn what's working in some areas. Some of it might not be relevant for my area, but I bet an awful lot of it is. So let's use this as an opportunity to see what's working in different places and see how we can ensure that everyone has the sort of opportunities that will allow them to prosper and be who they want to be. I know we could have a lot more questions, but I also know that networking and spending a bit of time with tea and coffee just talking to each other is also important. So I'm going to suggest that we bring it to a close. Can I thank our four panellists for their really interesting insights? Thank you. And a big thank you from all of us to the Young Foundation for the work that you're doing. It was absolutely, as you said, the right time, and it's really setting us off on a journey that I think we're all going to benefit from. Thank you, Debbie, for opening the event, and thank you for everyone in the team that's made this possible, and thank you to Toynbee Hall for hosting us. I really think being here today is absolutely significant, and it was a good choice. It's the right place to be. And it has been a really good discussion. I hope everyone on the live stream has enjoyed it as much as we have, and we look forward, Richard, to seeing how we can use the index, how we can use it as a tool to really make a difference and have an impact on people's lives. The full report is on london.gov, and we'll be resharing the report in a follow-up email after today's event. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your time. I can see from the smiles that this was a really enjoyable event, and I think we've all got a lot out of it. Please don't run away. There's tea and coffee, and it'd be a pleasure to talk to some of you. Thank you.
Thank you.